Chapter 8. Flies and Spiders. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a great sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leaned together, too old and strangled by with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was like a little bright hole far beyond, and the quiet was so deep that their feet seemed to thump along, while all the trees leaned over them and listened. As their eyes became used to the dimness, they could see a little way to either side in a sort of darkened green glimmer. Occasionally, a slender beam of sun that had had the luck to slip in through some opening in the leaves far above, and still more luck in not being caught in the tangled boughs and matted twigs beneath, stabbed down thin and brought before them. But this was seldom, and soon it ceased altogether. There were black squirrels in the wood. As Bilbo's sharp, inquisitive eyes got used to seeing things, he could glimpse of them whisking off the path and scuttling behind tree trunks. There were queer noises, too, grunts, scufflings, and hurryings in the undergrowth, and among the leaves that lay piled endlessly thick in places in the forest floor. But what made the noises he could not see. The nastiest things they saw were the cobwebs. Dense, dark cobwebs, with threads extraordinarily thick, often stretched from tree to tree, or tangled in lower branches on either side of them. There were none that stretched across the path, but whether because some magic kept it clear, or for whatever reason, they could not guess. It was not long before they grew to hate the forest as heartily as they hated the tunnel of the goblins, and it seemed to offer even less hope of ever any ending. But they had to go on and on, long after they were sick for a sight of sun and of the sky, and long for the feel of wind on their faces. There were no movement of air under the forest roof, and it was everlastingly still and dark and stuffy. Even the dwarfs felt it, who were used to tunneling, and lived at a time for long whiles without the light of the sun. But the Hobbit, who liked holes to make a house in, but not to spend summer days in, felt that he was being slowly suffocated. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch dark. Not what you call pitch dark, but really pitch. So black you really could see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hand in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Well, perhaps it is not true to say that they could see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together, and took in turns to watch, and when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness round them, and sometimes a pair of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a long little distance, and then slowly fade and disappear, and slowly shine out again in a different place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was most terrifying. But the eyes that he liked the least were the horrible, pale, bulbous eyes. Insect eyes, he thought, not animal eyes, only they are as much too big. Although it was not yet very cold, they tried lighting watchfires at night, but they soon gave that up. It seemed to bring hundreds and hundreds of eyes all round them, though the creatures, whatever they were careful never to let their bodies show in the flicker of the flames. Worse still, it brought thousands of dark grey and black moths, some nearly as big as your hand, flapping and whirring around their ears. They could not stand that. And nor the huge bats, black as a top hat either, and so they gave up fires and sat at night and dozed in the enormous, uncanny darkness. All this went on for what seemed to the Hobbit ages upon ages, and he was always hungry. for they were extremely careful of their provisions. Even so, as days followed days, and still the forest seemed just the same, they began to get anxious. The food would not last forever. It was in fact already beginning to get low. They tried shooting at the squirrels, and they wasted many arrows before they managed to bring one down in the path. But when they roasted it, it proved horrible to the taste, and they shot no more squirrels. They were thirsty, too, for they had none too much water, and in all the time they had neither seen neither spring nor stream. This was their state when one day they found their path blocked by running water. It flowed fast and strong, but not very wide right across the way, and it was black, or looked it in the gloom. It was well that Bjorn had warned them against it, or they would have drunk from it, wherever its color, and filled some of their emptied skins at its bank. And as it was that they only thought of how to cross it without wetting themselves in the water. There had been a bridge of wood across, but it had rotted and fallen, leaving only the broken posts near the bank. Bilbo, kneeling at the brink, peered forward and cried, There is a boat on the far side. Oh, why couldn't have it been on this side?" "How far do you think it is?" asked Thorin, for by now he knew Bilbo had the sharpest eyes among them. Not far at all. I shouldn't think it about 12 yards. 12 yards? I should have thought it 30 at least. My eyes don't see as well without as they used to 100 years ago. Still, 12 yards is as good as a mile. We can't jump it, and we can't wade or swim. Can any of you throw a rope? What's the good of that? The boat is surely tied up, even if you could hook it, which I doubt. I don't believe it's tied, said Bilbo. Though, of course, I can't be sure in this light. But it looks to me as if it was just drawn up on the bank, which was just as low there as when the path goes down into the water. Dori is the strongest, but Fili is the youngest, and still has the best sight, said Thorin. Come here, said Fili, and see if you can see the boat Mr. Baggins is talking about. Fili thought he could. So when he stared a long while to get an idea of the direction, the others brought him a rope. They had several with them, and on the end of the longest they fastened one of the large iron hooks they used for catching their packs to the straps about the shoulders. Fili took this in hand, balanced it for a moment, and then flung it across the stream. Splash! It fell in the water. Not far enough, said Bilbo, who was peering forward. A couple of feet, and you will have dropped it into the boat. Try again. I don't suppose the magic's strong enough to hurt you, if you touched a bit of wet rope. Fili picked up the hook, and when he had drawn it back, rather doubtfully all the same. This time he threw it with great strength. Steady, said Bilbo. You've thrown it right into the wood on the other side now. Draw it back gently. Fili hauled the rope back slowly, and after a while Bilbo said, Carefully, it's lying on the boat. Let's hope the hook will catch. It did. The rope went taut, and Fili pulled in vain. Kili came to help, and then Owen and Glóin. They tugged, and suddenly they fell over on the racks. Bilbo was the lookout, however, caught the rope, and with a piece of stick fended off the little back boat as it came rushing to the stream. Help! He shouted, and Balin was just in time to seize the boat before it floated off down the current. It was tied after all, said he, looking at the snapped painter that was still dangling from it. That was a good pull, my lads. A good job that our ropes was stronger. Who will cross first? Said Bilbo. I shall, said Thorin, and you will come with me, and Fili and Balin. That's as many as the boat will hold at a time. After that, Kili and Owen and Glóin and Dori, then Ori and Nori, Bifur and Bofar, and last, Dwalin and Bombur. I'm always last, and I don't like it, said Bombur. It's someone else's turn, so today. You should not be so fat. As you are, you must be with the last and lightest boatload. Don't start grumbling against orders, or something bad will happen to you. There aren't any oars. "Or are we to push the boat to the far bank?" asked the Hobbit. "Give me a length of that rope and have another hook," said Feely, and he got it ready, cast it into the darkness high and ahead as he could throw it. Since it did not fall down again, they saw it must have stuck in the branches. "Get in now," said Feely, "and one of you haul on the rope and stuck on the other tree on the other side. One of the others must keep hold of the hook we used first, and when you are unsafe on the other side, he can hook it back up, and you can draw the boat back." It was in this way that they all were soon far on the bank, safe across the enchanted stream. Dwalin had just scrambled out with the coiled rope on his arm, and Bombur, still grumbling, was getting ready to follow, when something bad did happen. There was a flying sound of hooves on the path ahead. Out of the gloom came suddenly the shape of a flying deer. It charged into the dwarves and bowled them over, and gathered itself for a leap. High it sprang and cleared the water with a mighty leap, but it did not reach the other side in safety. Thorn was the only one who kept his feet and his wits. As soon as they landed, he bent his bow and fitted an arrow in case any hidden guardian of the boat appeared. Now he sent a swift and sure shot into the leaping beast. As it reached the further bank it stumbled. The shadows swallowed it up, but they heard the sound of hooves quickly falter and then go still. Before they could shout and praise the shot, however, a dreadful wail from Bilbo put all thoughts of venison out of their minds. "Bombur has fallen in! Bombur is drowning!" he cried. It was only too true. Bombur was only foot on the land when the hart bore down on him and sprang over him. He had stumbled, thrusting the boat away from the bank, and then toppled back into the dark water, his hands slipping off the slimy roots at its edge. The boat span off slowly and disappeared. They could still see his hood above the water when they ran to the bank. Quickly they flung a rope with a hook towards him. His hand caught it, and they pulled him to the shore. He was drenched from hair to boots, of course, but that was not the worst. When they laid him on his back, he was already fast asleep, with one hand clutching the rope so tight they could not get it from his grasp, and fast asleep he remained in spite of all they could do. They were still standing over him, cursing their ill luck and Bumbur's clumsiness, and lamenting the loss of the boat, which made it impossible for them to go back and look for the hart, when they became aware of the dim blowing of horns in the woods and the sounds of dogs baying in the far off. Then they fell silent, and they sat. It seemed they could hear the noise of a great hunt going by the north of the path, but they saw no sign of it. There they sat for a long while, and did not dare to make a move. Bombur sat on with a smile on his fat face, as if no longer cared for all the troubles that vexed them. Suddenly, on the path ahead, appeared some white deer. A hind and fawns as snowy white as the hart had been dark. They glimmered in the shadows. Before Thorn could cry out, 3 of the dwarves had leaped to their feet and loosed arrows from their bows. None seemed to find their mark. The deer turned and vanished into the trees as silently as they had come, and in the vains the dwarves shot their arrows after them. "Stop, stop!" shouted Thorin. But it was too late. The excited dwarves had wasted their last arrows, and now the bows that Bjorn gave them were useless. They were a gloomy party that night, and the gloom gathered still deeper on them in the following days. They had crossed the enchanted stream, but beyond it the path seemed to straggle on just as before, and in the forest they could see no change. Yet, if they had known more about it, and considered the meaning of the hunt and the white deer that appeared upon their path, they would have known that they were at least drawing towards the eastern edge, and would soon have come, if they could kept up their courage and their hope, to thinner trees and places where sunlight came through again. But they did not know this, and they were burdened with the heavy body of Bombur, which they had to carry along with them as best they could. Tearing along the wearisome task, in turns of 4, while each the others shared their packs. If they had not become all too light in the last few days, they would have never managed it. But a slumbering and smiling Bomber was a poor exchange for packs filled with food, however heavy. In a few days' time, they came when there was practically nothing to eat or drink, nothing wholesome they could see growing in the woods, only funguses and herbs of pale leaves and unpleasant smell. About 4 days from the enchanted stream, they came to the part where most of the trees were beeches. They came to a first incline to be cheered by the change, for here there was no undergrowth, and the shadow was not so deep. There was a greenish light about them, and in places they could see some distance to either side of the path. Yet the light only showed them the endless lines of straight gray trunks, like pillars of some huge twilight hall. There was a breath of air and a noise of wind, but it had a sad sound. A few leaves came rustling down to remind them that autumn was coming in. Their feet ruffled among the dead leaves of countless other autumns that drifted over the banks of the path from the deep red carpets of the forest. Still, Bomber slept, and they grew very weary. At times they heard disquieting laughter. Sometimes there was singing in the distance too. The laughter was the laughter of fair voices, not of goblins, and the singing was beautiful. But it sounded eerie and strange, and they were not comforted. Rather, they hurried on from those parts with what strength they had left. 2 days later, they found their path going downwards, and before long they were in a valley filled entirely with the growth of mighty oaks. "Is there no end to this accursed forest?" said Thorin. "Somebody must climb a tree and see if he can get his head above the roofs and have a look round. The only way to choose the tallest tree that overhangs the path." Of course, somebody meant Bilbo. They chose him because, to be of any use, the climber must get his head above the topmost leaves, so he must be light enough for the hyacinth's limbless branches to bear him. Poor Mr. Baggins had never much practice in climbing trees, but they hoisted him to the lowest branches of an enormous oak that grew right out over the path, and up he had to go as best he could. He pushed his way through the tangled twigs with many a snap in the eye. He was greened and grimed from the old bark of the great boughs. More than once he slipped and caught himself just in time, and at last, after a dreadful struggle in a difficult place, there seemed to be no convenient branches at all, he got near the top. All the time he was wondering whether there were spiders in the tree, and how he was going to get down, except by falling. In the end, he poked his head above the roof of leaves, and he found spiders all right. But they were only small ones, of ordinary size, and they were after the butterflies. Bilbo's eyes were nearly blinded by the light. He could hear the dwarves shouting at him far below, but he could not answer, only hold on and blink. The sun was shining brilliantly, and a long while before he could bear it. When he could, he saw all around him a sea of dark green, ruffled here and there by breeze, and there were everywhere hundreds of butterflies. I expect they were kind of the purple emperor, a butterfly that loves the top of oak woods, but they were not purple at all. They were dark velvety black, without any markings to be seen. He looked at the black emperors for a long time, and enjoyed the feel of the breeze in his hair and on his face. But at length the cry of the dwarves, who were now simply stamping with impatience down below, reminded him of his real business. It was no good. Gaze as much as he might, he had seen no end to the trees and the leaves in any direction. His heart, that had been lightened by the sight of the sun and the feel of the wind, sank back into his toes. There was no food to go back to down below. Actually, as I have told you, they were not far off the edge of the forest, and Bilbo had the sense to see it. The trees that he had climbed down, though it was tall itself, was standing near the bottom of a wide valley, so that from the top the trees seemed to swell up all around him like the edges of a great bowl, and he could not expect to see how far the forest lasted. Still, he did not see this, and he climbed down full of despair. He got to the bottom again at last, scratched, hot, and miserable, and he could not see anything in the gloom below where he got there. His report soon made the others feel as miserable as he was. "The forest goes down on forever and ever and ever in all directions. Whatever shall we do? And of what use of sending a hobbit?" they cried, as if it was his fault. They did not care twopence about butterflies, and they were only more angry when he told them of the beautiful breeze, which they were too heavy to climb up and feel. That night they ate the very last scraps and crumbs of food, and the next morning when they woke, the first thing they noticed was they were still gnawingly hungry. And the next thing was that it was raining here and there, and the drip of it was dropping heavily on the forest floor. That only reminded them that they were also parchingly dry, without doing anything to relieve them. You cannot quench a terrible thirst by standing under great oaks and waiting for the chance drip to fall on your tongue. The only scrap of comfort that came unexpectedly from Bombur. He woke up suddenly and sat scratching his head. He could not make out where he was at all, nor why he felt so hungry, for he had forgotten everything that happened since they started their journey, than since that May morning long ago. The last thing he remembered was the party at the Hobbit's house, and they had great difficulty making him believe their tale of all the many adventures they had had since. When he had heard that there was nothing to eat, he sat down and wept, for he was very weak and wobbly in his legs. "Why did I ever wake up?" he cried. "I was having such wonderful dreams. Dreamed I was walking in a forest rather like this one, only lit with torches on the trees and lamps swinging from the branches and fires burning on the ground. And there was a great feast going on forever. A woodland king was there with a crown of leaves, and there was a merry singing, and I could not count or describe the things there were to eat and drink." "You need not try," said Thorin. "In fact, if you can't talk about something else, you'd better be silent. We are quite annoyed enough with you as it is. You haven't waked up. We should have left you to your idiotic dreams in the forest. You're no joke to carry, even after weeks of short commons." There was nothing now to be done but to tighten the belts round their empty stomachs, and hoist their empty sacks and packs, and to trudge along the track without any great hope of ever getting to the end before they lay down and died of starvation. They did this they did all day, growing very slowly weary, and while Bombur kept on wailing that his legs would not carry him, and that he did not want to lie down and sleep. "No, you don't," they said. "Let your legs take their share. We've carried you enough for as is." All the same, he suddenly refused to go on without a step further, and flung himself on the ground. "Go on if you must," he said. "I am just going to lie here and sleep and dream of food, if I can't get it any other way. I hope I never wake up again." At that moment, Balin, who was a little ways ahead, called out, "What was that? I thought I saw a twinkle of light in the forest." They all looked, and a longish way off, it seemed, they saw a red twinkle in the dark, and then another sprang up beside it. Even Bombur got up, and they hurried along, not caring if it was trolls or goblins. The light was in front of them, and to the left of the path, and when at last they had drawn level with it, it seemed plain that torches and fires were burning under the trees, a good way off their track. "It seems my dreams are coming true," said Bombur, puffing up behind. He wanted to rush straight off into the wood, across the lights, but the others remembered only too well the warnings of the wizards of Bjorn. "A feast would do no good if we never got back alive from it," said Thorin. "But a feast, and we shan't remain alive much longer, anyway," said Bombur. Bilbo heartily agreed with him. They argued about it back and forward for a long while, until they agreed at length to send out a couple of spies to creep up near the lights and find out more about them. But then they could not agree on who was to be sent. No one seemed anxious to run the chance of being lost and never finding his friends again. In the end, in spite of warnings, hunger decided them, because Bomber kept on describing all the good things that were to be eaten, according to his dream, in the woodland feast. So they all left the path and plunged into the forest together. After a good deal of creeping and crawling, they peered around the trunks and looking into the clearing where some trees had been felled and the ground leveled. There were many people there, elvish-looking folk, all dressed in green and brown and sitting on sawn rings of felled trees in a great circle. There was a fire in their midst, and there were torches fastened to some of the trees round them. And most splendid of all, they were eating and drinking and laughing merrily. The smell of roast meats was so enchanting to them. Without much waiting to consult one another, every one of them got up and scrambled forward to the rings with one idea of begging for some food. No sooner had the first one stepped into the clearing than all the lights went out as if by magic. Someone kicked the fire and it went up in a glint of rockets of glittering sparks and vanished. They were lost in a completely lightless dark and could not find one another, not for a long time at any rate. After blundering frantically in the gloom, falling over logs, bumping and crashing into the trees, and shouting and calling out till they must have waked everything in the forest for miles, they at last managed to gather themselves in a bundle, and by count themselves by touch. By the time they had, of course, quite forgotten the direction the path lay, and they were all hopelessly lost, or at least till morning. There was nothing for it but to settle down for the night where they were, and they did not even dare to search on the ground for scraps of food for fear of becoming separated again. But they had not been lying long, and Bilbo was only just getting drowsy, when Dory, whose turn was to watch first, said in a loud whisper, "The lights are coming out again from over there, and there are more of them than ever." Up they all jumped. There, soon enough, not far away, was scores of twinkling lights, and they had heard the voices and the laughter quite plainly. They crept slowly towards them, in a single line, each touching the back of the one in the front. When they got near, Thorin said, "No rushing forward this time. No one is to stir from hiding till I say. I shall send Mr. Baggins alone first to talk to them. They won't be frightened of him." What about me of them?" said Bilbo. "And anyway, I hope they won't do anything nasty to him." When they got to the edge of the circle of lights, they pushed Bilbo suddenly from behind. Before he had time to slip in on his ring, he stumbled forward into the full blaze of the fire and torches. It was no good. Out went all the lights again, and complete darkness fell. If it had been difficult collecting themselves before, it was far worse this time. They could simply not find the Hobbit. Each time they counted themselves and only made 13, and they shouted and called, "Bilbo Baggins, Hobbit, you dreaded Hobbit, hi, Hobbit, confiscate you, where are you?" And all sorts of things of that sort, but there was no answer. They were just about to give up hope when Dory stumbled across him by sheer luck. In the dark, he fell over what he thought was a log, and found it was the Hobbit, curled up fast asleep. It took a great deal of shaking to wake him, and when he was awake, he was not pleased at all. "I was having such a wonderful dream," he grumbled, "all about having a most gorgeous dinner." "Good heavens, he is gone like Bomber," they said. "Don't tell us about dreams. Dream dinners aren't any good, and we can't share them." "They're the best I'm likely to get in this beastly place," he muttered, as he lay down beside the dwarves and tried to go back to sleep and find his dream again. But that was not the last of the lights in the forest. Later, when the night must have been getting old, Kili, who was watching then, came and roused them all again, saying, there's a regular blaze of light begun not far away. Hundreds of torches and many fires must have lit suddenly and by magic, and hark to the singing and the harps. After laying and listening for a while, they found they could not resist the desire to go nearer and try once more to get help. Up they got again, and this time the results were disastrous. The feast they now saw was greater and more magnificent than before, and at the head of a long line of feasters sat a woodland king with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair, very much as Bomber described the figure in the dream. The elvish folk were passing bowls from hand to hand and across the fires, and some were harping and many were singing. Their gleaming hair was twined with flowers. Green and white gems glinted in their collars and their belts, and their faces and their songs were filled with mirth. Loud and clear and fair were those songs, and out stepped Thorin into their midst. Dead silence fell in the middle of a word. Out went all the lights. The fires leapt into black smoke. Ashes and cinders were in the eyes of the dwarves, and the woods was filled again with the clamour and their cries. Bilbo found himself running round and round, as he thought, calling and calling, Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, Glowin, Feely, Keely, Bumber, Buffer, Bofer, Dwalin, and Balin, Thorin, Oakenshield, while people he could not see nor fear were doing the same all around him, with an occasional Bilbo thrown in. But the cries of the others steadily got further and fainter, and though after a while it seemed to him they changed to yells and cries for help in the far distance, all the noise at last died right away, and he was left alone in complete darkness and silence. That was one of his most miserable moments. But soon he made up his mind that it was no good trying to do anything till day came with some little light, and quite useless to go blundering about tiring himself with no hope of any breakfast to revive him. So he sat himself down with his back to a tree, and not for the last time fell to thinking of his far distant Hobbit hole with its beautiful pantries. He was deep in thoughts of bacon and eggs and toast and butter, when he felt something touch him. Something like a strong, sticky string was against his left hand, and when he tried to move, he found his legs were already wrapped in the same stuff. So when he got up, he fell over. Then the great spider, who had been busy tying him up while he dozed, came from behind him and came at him. He could only see the thing's eyes, but he could feel its hairy legs as it struggled to wind its abominable threads around and round him. It was lucky that he had come to his senses in time. Soon he would not have been able to move at all. As it was, he had a desperate fight before he got free. He beat the creature off with his hands. It was trying to poison him to keep him quiet, as small spiders do to flies, until he remembered a sword and drew it out. Then the spider jumped back, and he had time to cut his legs loose. After that, it was his turn to attack. The spider evidently was not used to things that carried such stings at their sides, or it would have hurried away quicker. Bilbo came at it before it could disappear, and stuck it with his sword right between the eyes. Then it went mad and leaped and danced and flung out its legs in horrible jerks, until he killed it with another stroke. And then he fell down and remembered nothing more for a long while. There were the usual dim grey lights of the forest day about him when he came to his senses. The spider lay dead before him, and the sword blade was stained black. Somehow, the killing of the giant spider, all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or of anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach, and he wiped his sword on the grass and put it back in its sheath. "I will give you a name," he said, "and I shall call you Sting." After that, he set out to explore. The forest was grim and silent, but obviously he had first of all to look for his friends, who were not likely to be very far off, unless they had been made prisoners by the elves, or worse things. Bilbo thought it was unsafe to shout, and he stood a long while, wondering in what direction the path lay, and what direction he should go first to look for the dwarves. Oh, why didn't I remember Beorn's advice and Gandalf's, you lamented? What a mess we are in now. I only wish it were we. It is horrible being all alone. In the end, he made as good of a guess as he could as to the direction which the cries for help had come in the night, and, by luck, he was born with a good share of it. He guessed more or less right, as you'll see. Having made up his mind, he crept along cleverly as he could. Hobbits are clever at quietness, especially in woods, as I've already told you. Also, Bilbo had slipped on his ring before he started. That is why the spiders neither saw nor heard him coming. He picked his way stealthily from some distance, and when he noticed a place of dark, dense black shadow ahead of him, black even for the forest, like a patch of midnight that had never been cleared away. As he drew nearer, he saw that it was made by spider webs, one behind and one over, and tangled with another. Suddenly he saw, too, that there were spiders huge and horrible, sitting in the branches above him. In a ring or no ring, he trembled with fear, lest they should discover him. Standing behind a tree, he watched a group of them for some time, and then in the silence and stillness of the wood, he realized that these lonesome creatures were speaking to one another. Their voices were a sort of thin creaking and hissing, but he could not make out many of the words that they said. They were talking about the dwarves. "It was a sharp struggle, but worth it," said one. "What a nasty thick skins they are to have for sure, but I wager there is good juice inside." "Aye, they'll make for a fine eating when we've hung a bit," said another. "Don't let 'em hang for too long," said a third. "They're not as fat as they might be. Been feeding none of well too late, I should guess." "Kill 'em, I say," said the fourth. "Kill 'em now and hang 'em dead for a while." "They're dead now, I'll warrant," said the first. "They are not. I saw the struggling nurse just now coming round, I should say, after a beautiful sleep. I'll show you." With that, one of the fat spiders ran along a rope till it came to a dozen bundles hanging in a row from a high branch. Bilbo was horrified, now that he noticed them for the first time, dangling in the shadows, to see a dwarvish foot sticking out of the bottoms of some of the bundles, or here and there the tip of a nose, or a bit of a beard or a hood. The faster these bundles, the spider went. "It's Pull or Bombor, I bet," thought Bilbo, and nipped hard at the nose that stuck out. There was a muffled yelp inside, and a toe shut up and kicked the spider straight and hard. There was a life in Bombor still. There was a noise like the kicking of a flabby football, and the enraged spiders fell off the branch, only catching itself with its own thread just in time. The others laughed. "You are quite right," they said. "The meat's alive and kicking." "I'll soon put an end to that," hissed the angry spider, climbing back onto the branch. Bilbo saw the moment had come when he must do something. He could not get up to look at the brutes, and he had nothing to shoot with, but looking about, he saw that in this place there were many stones lying what appeared to be a now dry little watercourse. Bilbo was pretty fair shot with a stone, and did not find him long to find a nice smooth egg-shaped one that fit his hand cozily. As a boy, he used to practice throwing stones at things, until rabbits and squirrels and even birds got out of his way as quick as lightning if they saw him stoop, and even grown up, he had still spent a good deal of time at quoits, dart throwing, shooting at the wand, bowls, and knife pins, and other quiet games of the aiming and throwing sort. Indeed, he could do a lot of things, besides blowing smoke rings, asking riddles, and cooking, that I haven't had time to tell you about. There is no time now. While he was picking up stones, the spider had reached Bombar, and soon he would have been dead. At that moment, Bilbo threw. The stone struck the spider plunk on the head, and it dropped senseless off the tree, flop to the ground, with all its legs curled up. The next stone went whizzing through a big web, snapping its cords and taking off the spider sitting on the middle of it. Whack, dead. And after that, there was a great deal of commotion in the spider colony, and they forgot the dwarves for a bit, I can tell you. They could not see Bilbo, but they could make a good guess from which the stones were coming. As quick as lightning they came running and swinging towards the Hobbit, flinging their long threads in all directions, till the air seemed full of weaving snares. Bilbo, however, soon stepped away to a different place. The idea had come to him from the furious spiders further. The idea came to him to lead the furious spiders further and further away from the dwarves, if he could, to make them curious, excited, and angry all at once. With about 50 had gone off the place where he had stood before, he drew some more stones at these, and at others that had stopped behind. Then, dancing among the trees, he began to sing a song to infuriate them, and bring them all after him, also to let the dwarves hear his voice. This is what he sang. Old fat spider spinning in a tree, old fat spider can't see me. Attercop, you won't stop, stop your spinning and look for me. Old Tom Noddy, old big body, old Tom Noddy can't spy me. Attercop, down you drop, you'll never catch me up in your tree. Not very good, perhaps, but you must remember that he had to make it up himself on the spur of a very awkward moment. It did what he wanted anyway. As he sang, he threw up some more stones and stamped. Practically all the spiders in the place came after him. Some dropped to the ground, others raced along the branches and swung from tree to tree, or to cast new ropes across dark spaces. They made for his noise far quicker than he expected. They were frightfully angry. Quite apart, the stones had no spider had ever been like calling Attercop, and Tom Noddy, of course, was insulting to anybody. Off Bilbo scurried to a fresh place, but several of the spiders had run now to different points in the glade where they lived, and were busy spinning webs across all the spaces between the tree seams. Very soon, the Hobbit would have been caught in the thick fence all around him. That was at least the spider's idea. Standing now in the middle of a hunting and spinning insects, Bilbo plucked up his courage and began a new song. Lazy lob and crazy cob are weaving webs to wind me. I am far more sweet than other meat, but still they cannot find me. Here I am, naughty little fly, you are fat and lazy. You cannot trap me, though you may try, in your cobwebs crazy. With that he turned and found the last space between the two tall trees that closed with a web. But lucky, not a proper web, only a great strand of a double-thick spider rope ran hastily backward and forward from trunk to trunk. Out came his little sword. He slashed the threads to pieces and went off singing. The spiders saw the sword. They don't suppose they knew where it was, and at once the whole lot of them came in hurrying after the Hobbit along the ground and the branches, hairy legs waving, nippers and snippers snapping, eyes popping and full of froth and rage. They followed him into the forest until Bilbo had gone as far as he dared. Then, quieter than a mouse, he stole back. He had precious little time, he knew, for the spiders were disgusted and came back to their trees where the dwarves were hung. In the meantime, he had to rescue them. The worst part of the job was getting up on the long branch where the bundles were dangling. I don't suppose he would have managed if a spider had not luckily left a rope hanging down. With his help, though he stuck it to his hand and hurt him. He scrambled up, only to meet an old, slow, wicked, fat-bodied spider, who had remained behind to guard the prisoners, and had been busy pinching them to see which one was juiciest to eat. It had been the thought of starting the feast while others were away, but Mr. Baggins was in a hurry, and before the spider knew what was happening, he felt his sting and rolled off the branch dead. Bilbo's next job was to loose a dwarf. What was he to do? If he cut the string which hung them up, the wretched dwarf would tumble thump to the ground a good way below. Wriggling along the branch, which made all the dwarves dance and dangle like ripe fruit, he reached the first bundle. Feely or Keely, he thought, by the top of the blue hood sticking out from the top. Most likely Feely, he thought, by the tip of a long nose poking out from beneath the winding threads. He managed by leaning over to cut most of the strong threads that bound him round, and then, sure enough, with a Kithgor struggle, most of Feely emerged. I'm afraid Bilbo actually laughed at the sight of him jerking off his still arms and his legs as he danced off the spider springs under his armpits, just like one of those funny toys bobbling on a wire. Somehow or other, Feely got onto the branch, and then he did his best to help the Hobbit, although he was feeling very sick and ill from the spider poison, and hanging most of the night from the day wound round and round, with only his nose to breathe through. It took him ages to get the beastly stuff out of his eyes and eyebrows. As for his beard, he had to cut most of it off. Well, between them they started to haul up first one dwarf, then another, and slash them free. None of them were better off than Feely, and some of them were worse. Some had hardly been able to breathe at all. Long noses are sometimes useful, you see, and some had been more poisoned. In this way they rescued Keely, Bifur, Bofar, Dory, and Nori. Polar Bomber was so exhausted, he was just the fattest and been constantly pinched and poked, that he had just rolled off the branch and fell plop on the ground, fortunately on the leaves, and lay there. But there were still 5 dwarves hanging at the end of the branch when the spiders began to come back, more full of rage than ever. Bilbo immediately went to the end of the branch nearest the tree trunk and kept them back that crawled up. He had taken off his ring when he had rescued Feely and forgotten to put it on again, so now they all began to sputter and hiss. "Now we see you, you nasty little creature. We eat you and leave your bones and skin hanging on a tree. Ugh, he's got a sting, has he? Well, we'll get him all the same, and then we'll hang him downwards for a day or 2. While this was going on, the other dwarves were working at the rest of the captives, cutting the threads with their knives. Soon they would all be free, though it was not clear what would happen after that. The spiders had caught them pretty easily the night before, but they had been unawares, and in the dark. This time there looked to be like a horrible battle. Suddenly, Bilbo noticed that some of the spiders had gathered round old Bombar on the floor and tied him up again, and were dragging him away. He gave a shout and slashed at the spiders in front of him. They gave way quickly, and his scrambled and fell down the tree right into the middle of those on the ground. His little sword was something new in the way of stings for them. How it darted to and fro! It shone with delight as he stabbed at them. 6 were killed before the rest drew off and left Bombar to Bilbo. Come down, he shouted to the dwarves on the branch. Don't stay up there and be netted. For he saw spiders swarming up all the neighboring trees and crawling along the boughs above the head of the dwarves. Down the dwarves scrambled or jumped or dropped, 11 all in a heap, and most of them very shaky, and little use on their legs. There they were at last, 12 of them, counting Polar Bomber, who was being propped up on either side by his cousin Bifur and his brother Bofur. And Bilbo was dancing about, waving his sting, and hundreds of angry spiders were goggling up at them all around and about and above. It looked pretty hopeless. Then the battle began. Some of the dwarves had knives, and others had sticks, and all of them could get at stones, and Bilbo had his elvish dagger. Again and again the spiders were beaten off, and many of them were killed. But it could not go on for long. Bilbo was nearly tired out. Only 4 of the dwarves were able to stand firm, and soon all would be overpowered like weary flies. Already the spiders were beginning to weave their webs all round them from tree to tree. "I'm going to disappear," he said. "I shall draw the spiders off if I can, and you must keep together and make in the opposite direction. To the left there, in more or less the way towards the place where we last saw the elf fires." It was difficult to get them to understand, what with their dizzy heads and their stouts, and the whacking of sticks to the throwing of stones, but at last Bilbo felt he could delay no longer. The spiders were drawing into their circle ever closer. He suddenly slipped on the ring, and to the great astonishment of the dwarves, he vanished. Soon there came cries of Lazy Lob and Addercop, and from among them the trees away on the right. That upset the spiders greatly. They stopped advancing, and some went off in the direction of the voice. Addercop made them so angry that they lost their wits. Then Balin, who had grasped Bilbo's plans better than the rest, led an attack. The dwarves huddled together in a knot, sending a shower of stones as they dove at the spiders on the left and burst through the ring. Away behind them now the shouting and singing suddenly stopped. Hoping desperately that Bilbo had not been caught, and the dwarves went on. Not fast enough, though. They were sick and weary, and could not get much better than a hobble and a wobble, though many of the spiders were close behind. Every now and then they had to turn and fight the creatures who were overtaking them, and already some spiders were in the trees above them and throwing down their long, clinging threads. Things were looking pretty bad again, when suddenly Bilbo reappeared and charged into an astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. Go on, he shouted. "I will do the stinging." And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at the spider threads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if they came too near. The spiders' wells swelled with rage, and they sputtered and frothed, and hissed out horrible curses. But they had become mortally afraid of sting, and dared not come very near, now that it had come back. So curse as they would, their prey moved slowly but steadily away. It was a most terrible business, and seemed to take hours. But at last, just when Bilbo felt he could not lift his hand for a single stroke more, the spiders suddenly gave it up, and followed them no more, but went back, disappointed, to their dark colony. The dwarves did notice that they had come to the edge of a ring where the elf fires had been. Whether it had been one of those they had seen the night before, they could not tell. But it seemed that some good music lingered in such spots, where the spiders did not like. At any rate, the light was greener, and the boughs were less thick and threatening, and they had a chance to rest and draw breath. There they lay for some time, puffing and panting, but very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring interested them so much for a while they forgot their own troubles. Balin, in particular, insisted on having the golem story, riddles and all, told all over again, with the ring in its proper place. But after a time the light began to fail, and when other questions were asked, where were they? And where was the path? Was there any food? What they were going to do next? These questions they asked over and over again, and it was from little Bilbo that they seemed to expect to get the answers. For you can see that they had changed their opinion of Mr. Baggins very much, and begun to have a great respect for them. As Gandalf said they would. Indeed, they really expected him to think of some wonderful plan for helping them, and they were not merely grumbling. They knew only too well that they would soon all have been dead, if not for the Hobbit, and they thanked him many, many times. Some of them even got up and bowed right to the ground before them, though they fell over when the elf, with the effort, could not get on their legs again for some time. Knowing the truth about the vanishing did not lessen their opinion at all, for they saw that he had some wits, as well as luck and a magic ring, all things that are very useful possessions. In fact, they praised him so much that Bilbo began to feel that it really was something of a bold adventurer about himself after all, though he'd have felt a lot bolder still, if there had been anything to eat. But there was nothing at all, and none of them were fit to go on and look for anything, or to search for the lost path. The lost path! No idea would come into Bilbo's tired head. He just sat staring in front of them at the endless trees, and after a while he fell silent again. All except Balin. Long after the others had stopped talking and shut their eyes, he went on muttering and chuckling to himself. Golem, well, I'm blessed. So that's how you sneak past me, is it? Now I know. Just crept by quietly, did you, Mr. Baggins? Buttons all over the doorstep. Good old Bilbo. And after that, he fell asleep, and there was complete silence for a long while. All of a sudden, Dwalin opened an eye and looked around at them. "Where is Thorin?" he asked. It was a terrible shock. Of course, there were only 13 of them, 12 dwarves and the Hobbit. Where indeed was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered as they lay in the forest. They dropped off one by one to uncomfortable sleep, full of horrible dreams, as evening wore to black night, and they must leave for them for the present, too sick and weary to set guards or take turns at watching. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. You remember Bilbo falling into a log into sleep, as he stepped into the circle of light? The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and as the lights went out, he fell like a stone enchanted. All of the noise of the dwarves lost in the night, their cries that the spiders caught them and bound them, and all of the sounds of the battle next day would have passed over him unheard. Then the wood elves had come to him and bound him and carried him away. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is the distrust of strangers. Though their magic was strong, even in those days, they were wary. They differed from the high elves of the west, and were more dangerous and less wise. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to the ferry in the west. There were light elves and the deep elves, and the sea elves went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things, before some came back into the wide world. In the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt almost often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still elves they were, and remain, and that is, good people. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood, on its eastern side, there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors the stone of a river ran of the heights of the forest and flowed out and on into the marshes and feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened up on every side, wound far underground and had many passages and wide halls, but it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, nor so deep nor dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the grounds and in the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees. The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was the intimate enemy. In ancient days they had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and say they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and afterwards had refused to give them their pay. For if an elf king had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems. Though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet a great treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metal and jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had nothing to do with that old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him, and they took their spell off of him, and he came to his senses, and also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels shall be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin, and when he was brought before him, he asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king. "We did not attack them," answered Thorin. "We came to beg because we are starving." "Where are your friends now? And what are they doing?" "I do not know, but I expect starving in the forest." "And what were you doing in the forest?" "Looking for food and drink, because we were starving." "But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that, Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe till he feels inclined to tell us the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves of strong wooden dwarves and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins, and were reasonably well behaved, even to the worst enemies, when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things they had no mercy upon. There in the king's dungeon poor Thorin lay, and after he had got over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to the next chapter, and the beginnings of another adventure, in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness.